Dear participants, I'm very happy to be a moderator of this session. My name is Nurgul Ukueva. This session is on intra-household decisions in demographics. So households are building blocks, foundation of any society, any economy. And today we'll be looking at this micro level, family level, to understand both individual decision makings at the individual level and connect to the society and to the economy. So we'll have 20 minutes of presentations, three presentations, and then questions and answers, 10 minutes for questions and answers. You can type in your questions in the Q&A box below in the Zoom. And we'll be also happy to put you in the panel to ask your questions live in person, online, but with video on. So I'm very, very happy to present our first speaker, Professor Charlie Becker, my advisor, academic advisor, lifetime advisor. Professor Becker is from Duke University. He is the Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies at Duke University. Before joining Duke, he taught at Vanderbilt University, University of Colorado Boulder. He received his PhD from Princeton University. And worked at numerous projects on Central Asia, Kazakhstan pension reforms, Kyrgyzstan pension reforms projects. And we are lucky that he is interested in our countries, and his research interests are in Central Asia. He'll be presenting a paper on Ala-Kachuu, bride kidnapping, husbands and wives, who kidnaps whom and why. And this is a joint paper with Dr. Susan Steiner and Lin Zhao. Please welcome Dr.
Nurgul, thank you very much. And I'll start sharing my screen. I hope you can see it all without difficulty. I should begin by saying I first started living in Kyrgyzstan about the time that some of you were born. So it's been a long time. This was in 1998. At that time, I had no idea that Ala-Kachuu was a marriage option. And as I became aware, the question that came to me was, why does this institution exist, especially in a society where women are fairly empowered, certainly empowered relative to women in other surroundings, other nearby countries. And so I started working with Bahram Mirkasimov and Susan Steiner, and then Lin Zhao joined us, trying to identify conditions under which it would be rational to have kidnapping of women, and to what extent was this really kidnapping? As you talk with people, many people say, "Oh, it's our culture. It's all just a show." Others obviously say, "No, very much not." Susan and I have a couple papers, one with Bahram in demography, another with actually it's Steiner and Becker, not Becker and Steiner, who find in demographic research, we find negative outcomes to children in the demography paper. The children who are born in Ala-Kachuu households tend to be significantly lighter, which we take as a reflection on maternal stress. We then find in the Steiner-Becker paper that Ala-Kachuu marriages are much less positively assorted than in other marriages, though they still are. And so today we're going to try to identify preference parameters that would give rise to the sort of sorting that we observe in the marriage market. And we use the Life in Kyrgyzstan survey, especially the 2016 survey wave. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. You'll have access to the slides. And although I have to go and teach a class, you'll have access to Lin Zhao and Susan to ask them questions. So skipping through that, the obvious point of departure is to note that Ala-Kachuu, or kidnapping, захват невесты in Russian, is virtually non-existent among non-Kyrgyz population, and is quite common among the Kyrgyz population. In our total sample, almost 30% of population engages in non-consensual bride kidnapping among the Kyrgyz, and a few percent, presumably mostly ethnic Kazakhs, who were very similar to Kyrgyz, do so among the non-Kyrgyz population. We have to divide bride kidnapping. Fortunately, 2016 survey allows us to do this between consensual bride kidnapping, or what we would call elopement in English, and non-consensual bride kidnapping, which is what we're interested in. There's also a fairly even division in the population, non-Kyrgyz population, and to a lesser extent the Kyrgyz population, between so-called love marriages, which is, as an economist, I'm not sure love is a concept that we don't deal in, but by mutual agreement, and then arranged marriage. So it's a Kyrgyz-specific social practice, and it turns out that the kidnapping likelihood diminishes with educational attainment, but it doesn't vanish. So I'm skipping through these things very quickly. We have a bunch of regression results you can see, looking at profile similarity index and type of marriage. We also have lots of information from Life in Kyrgyzstan survey on mental health. And we find that, lo and behold, men and women in forced marriages in Ala-Kachuu have the highest prevalence of depression. For men and women, I'll show some histograms in a moment, but all kinds of depression. It's not one specific type. The results remain when age polynomials, which are correlated with depression since it varies over one's lifetime, when we control for age, the results remain the same. Education level is significantly negatively associated with depression, although causality is not so clear. This finding is true for both men and women. You can see there the likelihood of suffering a severe mental health problem is tiny for those who are engaged in consensual bride kidnapping. Presumably these are the most romantically attached people who are escaping their parents, since that's an obvious reason to have consensual bride kidnapping. If a woman's parent, if one of the sets of parents disapproves of the other spouse, then consensual bride kidnapping is a way of avoiding your parents' preferences, which may lead to improved happiness. The more typical, the blue, and which are love marriages, red arranged marriages are fairly stable, and then we have peaks for different types of depression. Peaks are their highest by far for non-consensual bride kidnapping. We estimate this hazard function. You can see that as well. And again, you'll have a chance to look at this. Interestingly enough, as almost a point of departure for us, when we look at the Kyrgyz sample only, then these coefficients of in the regressions, coefficients of non-consensual bride kidnapping are no longer significant. One possibility is that it is viewed as a social norm, but this also implies that Kyrgyz are more prone to depression. It also suggests that there's an equilibrium in which marriage options for young people are less attractive, because there's this possibility of forced marriage for women, semi-forced marriage for young men, since their parents can always tell them, Mukhtar, it's time for you to go get married, go find someone, and he has no choice. And so we look at an equilibrium model. Personality types, very quickly. In the transition, in Soviet era, personalities are not a strong determinant of types of marriage. In the transition era, open, conscientious, agreeable women are more likely to be targets of forced kidnapping. They seem to be less likely to resist. And these effects vanish in the post-transition era. Just skip through all these and get to our structural model, which is today's main topic. So what we want to do today is create a model that explains the shift of tastes of the marriage market. So why is it rational for some people to engage in kidnapping? And our intuition here is that men or women with identical characteristics may be valued differently in different marriage markets. So we're starting off as these are very preliminary results, but we're defining marriage market by marriage type, by location, and time. So, for example, personal charm or attractiveness may be valued more in the love marriage market than it would be in the kidnapped marriage market. These tastes, the values and markets, then may influence men and women's choice of marriage type. It's reasonable to think that given my characteristics, I might be valued more in an arranged marriage, for example, than in a love marriage or the outcomes of a Ala-Kachuu marriage. And so I would prefer an arranged marriage. When I say I'm really referring to both the bride or groom and their parents who have a lot of influence in all this. So we're going to create a structural model in which the expected utility of a man or woman choosing a specific marriage type is determined by the market tastes. So how does the market value different characteristics? Simple utility function is going to vary for basically, you can look at all these coefficients, but the beta coefficient is going to be our baseline valuation. That'll be love marriages that occur in urban areas that occur in the earlier Soviet era. And then there's a gamma term, which reflects different types of marriage, a delta term, which is a rural or urban indicator, and then lambda term, which indicates time, plus we have a variety of error terms. So as I said, our base case is the marriage type, and Lynn can talk at more length about identification, but we also need to define an outside option that has zero utility to identify all the parameters, including that for the base case. Lynn suffered enormously. Lynn Zhao suffered enormously because I and Susan, but especially me, it was my fault, never thought to inform him that marriage was almost universal in the Soviet era, and therefore the outside option hardly existed. The solution he came up with that I think was great is that to assume that anyone who is not married essentially by age 28, and we should play with different upper bound levels, especially for women. But anyone who isn't married by age 28 is essentially the same as being unmarried. They're outside regular markets because marriage is very age specific in Kyrgyzstan. And he then went and created these simulated data to make sure that we assume that the error term has its stream value on type 1 distribution. And so he's going to try to estimate these parameters that will fit the individual characteristics to their marriage type at a particular time, particular place, and given their characteristics. It worked well on simulated data once he corrected for it, once he included enough people for there to be a real outside option. Our resulting estimates are shown shown in table 1 for men. And there's a lot of coefficients here. We use height as a measure of attractiveness. 2016 actually allows us to have other attractiveness characteristics, but this is the one that's a fairly straightforward indicator. Local family indicates whether or not people are from the region, whether they're outsiders, or the individual in particular. Education level is fairly obvious. And also the also age and age squared terms, which basically desirability is going to be a nonlinear function of age, and it's going to be valued differently for different types, for arranged marriages, for non-consensual bride kidnapping, consensual bride kidnapping. This is from the perspective how the market values men relative to the base case. The beta term reflects Soviet era men in urban areas who engaged in love marriages. So we don't have a separate love marriage term. You can see that if we look over time that the main takeaways are parameters are quite stable, with the exception of age, which diminishes in importance over time, in part because those who get married in 2010 and thereafter are inherently younger, so we're just not identifying it as well. And the importance of residence rises. Same thing for women, except that we have non-consensual, we remove, in this example, non-consensual bride kidnapping as a result of choice, since presumably women do not deliberately choose to be married non-consensually, although we'll get to that. And we estimate that, so we estimate the model with only the other types of marriage options. And in equilibrium, the frequency of any kind of marriage type for both men and women should be equal, since they're pairing 1-to-1, and we haven't dealt with that yet either. Structural effects, the results over time, not very consistent. Age, again, the age term in most recent years, it falls in importance, and that's because there's more constant, there's less variation. Quick takeaways from this. First two, as Lynn can talk more about this, we use a random gradient descent. We had convergence problems, so we're not done. These are first regression, first estimations, and not final ones. Love marriages, the main results from the regression, the estimates. The love marriage market appreciates personal attractiveness more than other types of marriage do. So if you're highly attractive, then you have a choice of spouses. Highly attractive isn't literally height. In this case, we'll see if that holds. Higher education is valued less in both bride kidnapping markets and for both men and women. Relative to love marriages, increasing age is valued more for men, but less valued for women in other markets. So there's a premium on relatively young women, although one does not generally kidnap before completion of secondary school. Those most likely to be involved in equilibrium and bride kidnapping, those who are less physically attractive and those who are less well educated. Our counterfactuals that we haven't, that we need to do is what if bride kidnapping isn't an option? We need to estimate that for men. We also need to add a non-consensual bride kidnapping option for women. And its value, which could well be negative, likely is negative, relative to the outside option of non-marriage, which we anchor at equaling 0, then is going to affect the other choices according to a hazard function that we need to estimate. So if you basically exposing yourself, especially to love marriage, since arranged marriages tend to occur earlier. If you want to go into the love marriage market, you face this outside or consensual bride kidnapping market. You face this risk of being kidnapped, and if that has negative utility, then that's going to affect a woman's decisions. We need to also re-estimate this for robustness purposes, excluding Bishkek, which is really different, very different city. And then we also need to add more personal characteristics. There's a whole lot of them in Life in Kyrgyzstan survey, and to make the model tractable, I suppose we'll use some sort of principal components model and just look at the first few principal components. Then there's a whole lot of supplemental tables in the appendix, but that's it. And gosh, I did it in 20 minutes. This is, I hope you guys find this interesting.
Thank you, Professor Becker, for very interesting presentation and on an important topic. I welcome questions in the Q&A box. I had trying to understand, it's very interesting trying to understand it from a structural perspective and trying to think that this is not a random process, but it's more of a matching between men and women. So there are specific types of people who would go into this or that type of marriage. But I was trying to understand if this is, it could be true for men because they have a choice of kidnapping or not kidnapping, but for women it could be very random, purely random process. So I just wanted to know what you think about this, Professor Becker.
So yes, it could be a very random process. So by looking at two different types of models, we both estimating a structural model in which exposure to kidnapping is rational versus one in which it isn't, and comparing those differences is the way that we'll try and get at this, to see how much it matters, and also to see to what extent, if involuntary kidnapping does have negative value relative to the outside option, then to what extent it explains willingness to participate in, especially the love marriage or consensual kidnapping marriage markets. So we don't have answers to that yet, but hopefully we will. And this is, yeah.
Thank you. And there is a question from Dr. Kravchenko, and he can ask live, right? Yeah. Okay.
I really enjoyed the paper. What about regional differences?
Lynn, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, probably, yeah. This is Lane. I'm Professor Becker's student, and so for the regional differences, so first in this preliminary work, in a structure model, if you notice, we have the gamma coefficient, which captures the regional differences. So basically now in this preliminary model, the regional, so there's indicator from the LiK survey data that indicates whether interview is from a rural area or an urban area. So basically the coefficient of gamma captures the regional differences. So this is one thing. Another thing, if you want to know specifically how the regional differences influences their choice of marriage, so for now, because I have listed there that like the coefficient we estimated are not fully converged. So for now, the idea that we want to convey is that so using such a structure model can help to understand how these different factors influence the choice of marriage over time, locations, and market. And finally, we'll add more coefficients and also the robustness test to make sure the estimated parameters are robust, so that like once we get to that step, we can see specifically, okay, how the regional differences influence the choice of marriage. And if like by regional differences, you mean that we should consider different, for example, oblasts. So there are 8 oblasts from the LiK survey data. So that could be the next step. But one thing to notice that due to the data sample limits, if we include way more locations or time periods, that would result in identification problems. So this is why at this step, we include only the rural and urban area, these 2 areas to consider. And I also thought a question that asks, what about the patterns from the mixed families? So so for this structure model, we have Professor Becker has just presented before. We use the Kyrgyz only data. So first, like the mixture family is of a small proportion from LiK survey data. And second, like one considering the bright kidnapping, which is more considered to be a Kyrgyz norm, if I understand correctly. So for this purpose, we use the Kyrgyz sample only for now. So of course, for the robustness test, we can also take the mixed family into consideration. And also thanks for this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Alisher, did it answer your question?
Yes, because my point was basically, was the bride kidnapping a way for a groom and a bride from different ethnic backgrounds? Because I think arranged is something which is not feasible in that case.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any other questions. So we go for the next presentation. If there are any more questions, then we can also discuss at the end of the session. So the next presenters are Maya Moritz and Julius Schölkopf. Both of them are working on their graduate degree in the University of Mannheim, and they are presenting a paper on birth order and the quantity-quality trade-off in Kyrgyzstan. So please, welcome.
So my name's Maya Moritz, and alongside Julius Schölkopf, I will be presenting our paper, The Quantity-Quality Trade-Off and Birth Order in Kyrgyzstan, which we wrote with our co-author, Leo Gärtner. So our paper will begin with an introduction, and then we'll move to a description of our data before going through the methodology, explaining our results, then discussing and concluding. So to begin, our paper draws on a long literature of family planning policy effects in Asia, beginning with Nurgul et al. In 1990, and they've written many papers since then. So they look at the effect of the fertility transition, whereby families that, for example, in the 1900s were quite large and then later on became much smaller, in addition to family planning policies. So they found that as family size decreased, education years of the children increased, and nationally there was an overall increase in human capital. So this is a very positive effect, and it draws on the Becker and Holmes model. So this very basic model shows us that there is a quantity-quality trade-off in child investment. The idea here is that as children are added to the family, the budget constraint of the family binds, and the family is not able to invest more in the child's human capital through their education or time with the parents or several channels. Many additions have been made to this model, and one recent one that we can highlight is Bardwaj. So they add a public good dimension to the quantity-quality trade-off, whereby it's easier to raise twins, for example, than a 19-year-old and a 9-year-old. Your time is better spent between closer spaced siblings, which leads us to our next question of whether average spacing has an effect on this trade-off. So there's 2 directions this could go. If you say that smaller spacing mitigates the trade-off, then you could be saying that with twins, they can share books. They'll likely be in the same school level, so they can go to the same school, perhaps lower income and have the same uniform, so maybe less of a time investment. On the other hand, if you say that larger spacing may mitigate the effect, you may be arguing that parents learn from raising older children and then are more efficient investors in their younger children. They could use hand-me-downs, or perhaps the older children could either be allowing the parent to work through babysitting or bringing in money to the household themselves and then raising the budget constraint. And then finally, we're just checking to see if the main channel for this effect could be through the income devoted to education. So turning now to our paper, which was inspired in some ways by the Dahan methodology, we tackled the research question of whether family size influences educational outcomes in Kyrgyzstan. So we'll start with a basic OLS, which will of course have bias in it as there's selection into family size. So then we'll use two instruments that are quite common in the literature. The first is the presence of twinning. So the incidence of twinning should be an exogenous shock to fertility. So besides fertility treatments, which is less of a problem in this sample than say a US sample, twins should not be expected or not planned for at least. And then the number of children in the family is likely to rise above the threshold at which the parents would have wanted to stop having children. So therefore we can see increased family size in families that may not have selected into that. Then our other instrument is sex mix of the children. So in countries at different parts of the fertility transition, we see different patterns. In countries in the middle or beginning of it, such as the countries in the Middle East and Africa, we often see a son preference. And then in families where the first child is a female, these families are then more likely to choose to have more children in order to have a son. Then in studies of the US and more developed countries, on the end of their fertility transition, we see a preference for sex mix, so a girl and a boy, and families that have two boys or two girls are then more likely to have additional children in order to achieve this balance. So this is another exogenous shock and should raise the number of children in the family without selection into it, as we should expect 50-50 likelihood of a girl or a boy. So these are our instruments, and then we'll look at education years and more importantly, the share of income spent on education as our outcome variables. We use the 2011 year of the Life in Kyrgyzstan dataset, and our results largely point to some significance in the OLS being largely shown as due to bias as our instrumental variables show no significant trade-off between quantity and quality among Kyrgyz households. There are a few reasons for this, and this could be, for example, relatively low overall education levels or families simply not changing educational investments or expenditures based on the number of children. This is just not entering into their decision. So now we'll see a graphical representation. First we'll go through the data. We have two samples, and on the left we see our adult sample. So these are adults living in the household after completing all of their education. So we have nice variation in the education, in the family size, and we have a small data set, but mostly balanced. Two areas of unbalance are in female. So 32% of our sample is female. Obviously, we would prefer something more even. Why is this? Well, that's likely because women in Kyrgyzstan in the literature are shown to be more likely to leave the home when they marry. So they'll either move into their the husband's family home or the husband's home, and therefore they won't be counted in this data as we can't follow people after they've left home. We also have 35% of people living in the city, which is lower than the actual amount of people with urban residents. This might introduce bias because larger families tend to reside in the countryside, but we'll control for this later on. And then our second sample is school children. So currently attending school and living in the home. We've got larger family sizes here on average and a more balanced sample with respect to females. So this is a really nice data set where we can control for not only the mother and father's education, which would be inputs for the child and reflect values of education, but also the household head, which is important because in households where there's only a mother or only a father, they wouldn't be counted in some specifications otherwise. So now we will look at data visualization, a kernel density estimator of the difference between log expenditure share on education of the first and the fourth born. So we can see through the red lines a significant mean difference. This is what the OLS will pick up, but this could be due to bias, and as we'll see, it likely is. So later our instrumental variable will address this. Now moving to our methodology, we will begin with just our simple OLS with an outcome variable of education years for the adult in question. Then we have a constant, and then our first outcome, the coefficient of interest is beta 1, which looks at family size, the number of children in the family, coded as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then beta 2 is the coefficient for our order dummies. So with the first born omitted as the reference group, we then have second, third, fourth, etc. born. And then we have a control vector, and this includes parental or household head education years, the child's age, urban residence, and gender. So now Julius will take you through our results.
Well, thank you, Maya. So also hello from my side. I will continue now with our results and some additional methodology. So when we look at the results, I always mark the lines that are important in bold. So using only the number of children to explain the education years of a child, as you can see in the first column, we get by OLS a statistically significant negative effect. However, including the parental education years in column 2 and additionally adding birth order dummies in column 3, we still get a negative effect, but the effect is not significant anymore. In column 3 and 4, the adjusted R squared is almost 20%, which seems to be really good for survey data. Surprisingly, the birth order dummies here are also not significant. So when we compare the adjusted R squared here, including the birth order dummies, so whether you first born, second born, third born, and this doesn't change much compared to column 2. In column 4, we additionally control for ethnicity and living in a city, and here the results do not change much compared to column 3. So only 2 ethnicities are, for instance, different here, statistically significant here, and living in a city in general doesn't play a role in those regressions as well. So column 5, we additionally use only the household's head education, and here you can see that we get an effect of almost the same size as in column 1, at least for the number of children. However, there are alternative measures to judge educational quality, as Maya mentioned before. As a second approach, we look at a logarithmic expenditure share for all kids in our paper. So please note that when we use the education expenditure as a dependent variable, we always use the second sample with kids still attending school. We define the expenditure share as the yearly investment into education of a child over the yearly income. The share is then, of course, by construction between 0 and 1. Since the values are relatively small, we use the logarithmic expenditure share, and as before, we use the number of children as a predictor controlling for the order, as well as parental education and gender. Furthermore, as you can see in equation 3, we also use the average space between the kids in the family as a predictor. When we look at the OLS estimation here, which is using a different dependent variable, we can see that a number of children has, again, a negative effect on the education expenditures, also including the birth order dummies in column 3. We see that birth order matters for expenditures. And note that in column 5, the coefficient for the number of children means that one additional children, ceteris paribus, reduces the estimated share of education expenditures by 6.8%. However, the overall share, we explain the variance of the education expenditures in this regressions is relatively low compared to the previous model. When we look at the same model using average space as the key regressor, we can see that the coefficient is never statistically significant different from 0. We can also see that a model in general has a really bad fit explaining the differences in education expenditures. So interpreting the coefficient in model 1 would mean that 2 years difference, so 24 months between the kids on average in a household, would lead to an increase in the share of education expenditures of 3%. However, those coefficients are not statistically significant different from 0. So there's a problem, because we can clearly assume that the number of children is correlated with unobservable characteristics of the households that are not included in our model, yielding to a biased OLS estimate. So following the literature, we address this endogeneity problem by using twins at last birth and the sex mix of the first two children separately as instruments for the number of children in a household and the presence of twins for the average space. This is what Maya mentioned before, and when we look at that, so from the point, the methodology, we see that for the firstborn child in a household for different family sizes, we can estimate the structural equation using a two-stage least square approach. So for reliable estimates, our instruments must satisfy relevance and exclusion restriction. So therefore, the instrument must be uncorrelated with our error term, while it's simultaneously sufficiently correlated with the number of children or the average space. Here for the twins at last birth instruments, as Maya mentioned before, the exogeneity relies on the assumption that twinning is not correlated with any factor that may determine family size or influence education years. We use this instrument here because twins are unintended fertility shock above the family size, family potentially intended. And the second instrumental approach uses, or we assume that the gender of the first two children in the family is random. This goes back to Angrist, who argues that some people have a preference for having a balanced sex mix among their children. Also, instead of using education years as a dependent variable, we also look at the income spent on education in logarithmic terms as a dependent variable in our regressions. So I will now present the results of using our IV approaches. So here you can see, or here we regress a family size on the years of completed education of the firstborn child in the household. All those regressions include controls for age, gender, and education of the household head or the parents. And in the first two columns, we observed that either using the parental education or the education of the household head, that we get an OLS coefficient that is large, negative, and significant. And this changes if we look at the IV estimates in column 3, 4, 5, and 6. So for both instruments, the estimates of family size, they turn insignificant. The twins at last birth instruments, in this case in column 3 and 4, seems to be a strong instrument with an F statistic of 22 or 28, whereas the same sex dummy is hardly, it's not explaining family size, and also the F statistic is below 1 and below 4 in that case. So then we probably have a weak IV problem. But this is not the case when we look at the IV twins. It's potentially not the case when we look at the IV twins at last birth, where we also have statistically significant coefficients on the first stage of our two-stage least square procedure. When we look at the same thing using average space and the effect on education years, we can separate that into 3, 4, and 5 children families. So we perform those regressions for different household sizes separately in order to not confound our results with potential other existing family size effects. And our instrument for this regression is whether there was a twin birth, or more precisely, there are twins present in the household. So our findings here suggest that for the 3-child families, our instrument is relevant and therefore valid if we believe in the exogeneity condition for 3 children families. So we have an F statistic of 113. This is not the case for 4 and 5 child families, where the F statistic is below 10, but we still get a significant coefficient on the first stage, but we do not get our coefficient of interest on the second stage. The average space here is not significant. When we look at the education expenditures, this is a different channel as we've discussed before. And when we look at the firstborn children only and use IV as an IV, the twins at last birth and the same sex, we can again see that our IV twins at last birth instruments is doing a better job here, where we have F statistics of 34 and 40. And again, we get significant coefficients here on the first stage. However, we do not really get statistically significant coefficients on the second stage. So we only see that the number of children is statistically significantly different from 0 and 10% level if we look at twins last birth and using the household head's education. Okay. And to finish the set of tables, we study also the relationship between average space and the log school expenditure share. So the regression coefficients are here reported again separately for different family sizes, and also average space is not significant in those regressions. So when we again look, except for 4-child families, we potentially have a weak IV problem here, as our instrument, the presence of twins, is only relevant for 4-child families. But however, average space is not significant in these regressions. All in all, we've seen that simple OLS regressions do not give us a potentially relationship between families as an average space, as child quality measures such as years of completed education and educational spending. Our IVs are, if we use the twins at last birth instrument, often strong enough to show that there is no significant effect, and that indicates that there is indeed an endogeneity problem, and also that this doesn't seem to matter here in these cases, and which is also consistent with finding from previous studies, as it was, for instance, in the Han. Before concluding, I want to briefly discuss the results and point out on some things. So we're still in process, so this is not a final version, but our study is limited by some elements of our data set. So the LiK and Kyrgyzstan study yields a relatively small sample among studies of the quantity-quality trade-off compared to studies, for instance, for the US or for China. Additionally, when we control for parental education, this implies that we only use the subsample of offsprings who have completed their education in order to be linked with their parents. So there might be some issues here because, yeah, children who have completed education might not still live in their parents' household, do not have linked the data to their parents. So this is a thing, and also this might explain an unequal sex distribution in our estimates for the first sample, because females are probably more likely to move into husband's household. And also this selection bias might become even more severe because potentially children with a very good education are more likely to not live at their parents' place, and it's also an important point here. And another source of error may be a weak identification problem here, arising from a weak correlation between the instrument and the error term. However, we can confirm that when, for instance, look at Craig-Donald F statistics, that they are larger than the required thresholds. And so twins can be considered a pretty fine instrument in this application. Overall, our study is, to the best of our knowledge, probably one of the first evaluations of this kind for Kyrgyzstan. We do find an OLS evidence of this trade-off, but when we use the instrumental variables, we do not find a significant relationship. We also do not find an effect of spacing or birth order, and our estimates show that variation in the share of income, pretty much education is probably the main channel that is driving those results. We also find gender equality in educational outcomes, which is consistent with reports about Kyrgyzstan that we've read. And there are potentially a lot of important areas for future research. We're not sure whether the differences here are driven by human capital formation, or whether we have other channels that play an important role here. So recent studies in the US, they, for instance, look at network effects, and they seem to be also quite interesting. So that was our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Julius, Maya. Please, panelists or attendees, questions, you can type in Q&A or ask questions by video. Welcome questions.
If I may, Nurgul. Because
Yes,
I can't type
yes.
in the Q&A, since I'm one of the panelists, I can't type in there. So thanks for this very interesting paper. 2 comments. I actually have more, but let me restrict this to 2. I'm not surprised at all that the same-sex variable is not a good instrument. And I would claim that there is some preference in Kyrgyzstan. So I wonder why you didn't use this, or I would recommend using the gender of the first child as an instrument for the number of children. And second, I found it surprising that when you use education expenditures as an outcome variable, that the birth order seems to matter. So I wonder what exactly is included in education expenditures, because if it's, it's going to be very different if it's tuition fees, which you have to pay for each child, or if it's things like school uniforms or school books, which you buy once and then every child can use it afterwards. So I don't recall what is included in the data. If you could answer that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, so I mean, you can start with the first one. Yeah, this same-sex thing is also something where we still probably need to work on, because it's an interesting field out of Kyrgyzstan. The educational expenditures are the core variable from the Life in Kyrgyzstan survey data. So this is the decimal, how much education how much do you spend on education for this child? I think this is in the household questionnaire, one of those first big tables. I don't know the exact question anymore, but yeah, this is the row. I think it's something 120 area, something there. But I can check this.
Additionally, for the son preference, we were interested in both because we saw in the data set that there was so it's interesting because there's a large Muslim majority, and in countries that tend to look at Hindu and Muslim cultures, they do tend to use, like in the Suda study, firstborn male. But we couldn't do that here because we actually, firstborn female, but we actually have few firstborn females because most of them ended up leaving the home. Is our interpretation of our low amount of females. So actually this would have some bias in it as well. So we would need to be able to follow the individual after they left the home to use that. And I don't think it's possible with this data set. And then for the income, for the expenditures, I don't remember them explicitly stating what it was, but it was consistent in several measures. So it would be interesting to see, because that would be a great way to look at the distancing effects between the siblings, and also an interesting way to change rural and urban, because I would imagine there would be some differences there. But again, with our small sample size, that might also be limiting, as once we split the sample, even into rural and urban, we're going to have very few observations.
Maybe I can come back to Susan's question. So we use the H121, which is indeed school fees and tuitions, all those educational supplies, and non-formal payments like building repairs, and all those taken together. Mm. So we might,
so it's a mix, right?
The tuitions out. Yeah, we haven't thought that everybody has to pay tuitions in that sense in Kyrgyzstan. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is Bogdan. This is part of a larger study of Asia, as I understand. The preliminary data that you find for Kyrgyzstan, is Kyrgyzstan an outlier, or is it very similar to other countries? Or is this too early to judge?
I think this may be a problem with my phrasing in the second slide. We were inspired by Knudels et al.'s work in several Asian countries, but our work was only with Kyrgyzstan. We did, however, have separate ethnicities, which had some significant differences, which speaks to maybe some of the difference between the Muslim culture. I don't want to generalize, but in those studies, they use one instrument versus the Soviet culture that was left over. So it's really interesting to disentangle those effects, quite difficult with this sample size. And also we only, within borders, have Kyrgyzstan, but it would be incredibly interesting to compare this to border countries and to the entire continent.
I have really quick data question. Because you have used the mother's education and father's education data in this data set, and you also mentioned that there's a selection bias because you're only able to use the data with those who also who live with their parents. So am I correct that for these two variables, father's education and mother's education, so you apply the education data and use this the household relationship data and trace back like what is education for fathers and mothers? Because I also want to control the father and mother's education data, but to my understanding, the LiK 2011 data does not directly provide the father and mother's education data. Am I correct?
Yeah, and we use on the one hand we use the direct education in the within household. So when we had the household head, for instance, father, mother, and then we use their children's. Sometimes also in the data you have the education variables for mother and father were explicitly asked, but this is also not often the case there. So that's why we expect that there is a selection bias in that sense. But I mean, it could be also that there is no selection bias depending on the way the households were selected.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we faced the same problem. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Elira. You had a Elira.
Yeah.
Welcome. Yes.
Question. Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting research about mother's education. Most families, parents are in Russia on migration. So did you take into account those families, migrants families where there are no parents, or one of the parents are on migration and their babushkas or grandparents are taking care of them? So you asked the education of grandparents in this case.
We haven't, well, interesting question. We thought about parts of your question. So we tried to use the household head education for those families where the household head is not living anymore, is not living in the household per se, or is somewhere abroad, which yields us around 400 or 500 additional observations. We try to control for that. We haven't looked at a grandfather's education in our data set, but if you think that this is based on the societal things in Kyrgyzstan, which we're not so much aware of, we can try to look at that. This is a really interesting point. Thank you very much for this comment.
I think it's also related to how the children are raised. So we thought about that because there's a lot of literature. I think it's the man's name might be Ushchenko, who wrote about how a child's IQ and education is affected by not only his parents' education, but by everyone he grew up with. So children in larger families are exposed to lower IQs in their younger siblings and may be worse off than a child that grows up as the only child in the home. So we did consider this, but I think most of our sample did have a parent living in the home, and the Russian control, well, that's one of the ethnicities that was controlled for, may cover some of this, but it's an interesting channel as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the time is for the next presentation. Thank you, Maya, Julius, and the audience for interesting questions and discussion. So our next presenter is Manzura Jumaniyazova from Technical University of Munich. She is a PhD student there, and her research is on the role of son preferences and birth order in child development in Kyrgyzstan. Please, Manzura.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Nurgul, for introduction. And today my paper is on the role of son preference and birth order in child development. And I think the later discussion kind of lays quite an interesting insight to this topic. And today my outline looks as follows. I will first talk about the motivation of the paper and then methodology and results. I will talk about the robustness checks that I'm doing for checking the results, and then I will talk about the strengths and limitations, and then I conclude. So the motivation of the paper stems from the missing women field, and the term missing women refers to the number of girls who would be alive if they have been treated equally as boys. And according to the United Nations estimates, there are around 100 million missing women around the world, which far more exceeds the number of deaths from World War I and World War II, famines, and all other pandemics, and which is very, very tragic. So missing women is partly the result of son preference, because son preference leads to the differential pre- and postnatal treatment of girls based on their gender, and also gender-based sex selection. The son preference is very prevalent in South Asia, East Asia, and the Caucasus, but there is a very scarce evidence on Central Asia, despite the patrilocal and patrilineal context of the country. So son preference has many, many reasons, including social, economic, religious, and other reasons, but mainly it persists because of the lower value attached to girls. And one of the explanations is lower earning potential of girls and gender wage gap, which places lower value to raising girls. And at the same time, motherhood penalizes women a lot when they leave the labor market, and then rejoining the labor market forces them to choose the jobs that are lower paid and that do not represent their educational level. Another reason is religious, because in many patrilineal societies, family lineage can only be continued through male heirs, and there are a number of religious rituals that can be performed only by sons. And the last but not least is that in patriarchal societies, women move in with husband's family. So for most of the families, it doesn't pay off to invest into their girls. Or as one of the very well-known proverbs in India says, raising a girl is like watering a neighbor's garden. So having this all in mind, I've digged into the literature, and the evidence suggests that indeed girls experience higher abortion rates. They're breastfed for shorter periods, they have lower immunization rates, they are more prone to neglect and inadequate childcare during infancy, which indeed mortality and morbidity rates of girls. And because families try to get boys, and if it's something that is must to have for the families, they try for boys in case the older siblings are girls, which leads to the fact that girls grew up with more siblings compared to boys. And last but not least, is that girls receive less education and health investments compared to their brothers. So the study context is Kyrgyzstan, which is like other countries in the Central Asia, performs poorly on gender inequality index. And upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, those countries in Central Asia reversed back to their traditional views. And now they portray women as caregivers and mothers, which marginalize women in the society. The incidence of bride kidnapping, which was said before, Ala-Kachuu, and early marriage and forced marriage increased after the independence in Kyrgyz Republic. And 23% of women have been physically abused at least once in the age range of 15 to 49. And still for 30% of women and 50% think that men are justified in beating their wives, which is very sad. Turning to maternal mortality, it is very high at 76 maternal deaths per 100,000 lives, and stunting, which is lower height for age for children under 5, is at 12%, which is high, and it peaks for children at the age of 1.5 and 2 years old at 17%. So the evidence on Central Asia is quite scarce because all the evidence on son preference is mostly focused on South Asia and East Asia, or the Caucasus. And that's why it was my prior goal to dig deeper into this topic and to study the son preference and the role of birth order in Central Asia, specifically in Kyrgyzstan. And these are the research questions that I'll be asking throughout the paper. So the first one is that I want to know if there is a son preference in the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, or to put it differently, is there a girl penalty in the physical development of a child? Third, I will be asking about if the birth order of a child matter in child development, regardless of the gender. And then the last is there a youngest son preference in the Kyrgyz Republic? I will elaborate on the last part quite more because this is the most interesting and compelling part of this paper, I would say. So for this analysis, I used Life in Kyrgyzstan panel data set, but not all of the waves, but 2011, 12, 13, and 16. When I restricted the sample for children under the age of 5 years old, I ended up with around 1,500 children for each wave, more or less. And now I turn to the estimation strategy. So the dependent variable of interest is height for age z-score, which is now proxying for me the nutritional status of a child. There are two common measures of nutrition for children, which is height for age or weight for age. I'm not choosing weight for age because weight can be prone to short-term shocks, which can be present during the data collection. So I opt for height for age z-scores. The main independent variables are children's gender and birth order, and for girls is the interaction of the two. So I'm omitting the firstborn child in both cases for girls and for boys, and then I have second-born child and third or later born child in the household, which stands for boys, second and third or later born boys within the household. And then I have a dummy for females to check if there's a general son preference. And then I have interaction of gender and birth order for girls, for second born girl, and third or later born girl within the household. X is a vector of control variables, which includes age, age squared, household size, highest education attained in the household. And in the previous discussion, we talked that there were some of the mothers or fathers education missing, or they were in the migration. So that's why I decided to go for the highest attained education within the household. Also household income quantile, mother's age at birth, and mother empowerment index, which I constructed using principal component analysis, using 4 categorical variables on the gender attitudes on women's career, decision-making, education of children, and also views on being a housewife. So turning to the results, this is the visual representation for 2011 and 2016. And this is the mean height for age z-score for boys and girls, depending on their birth order. And in the first graph, you can see the data for 2011. And here we can already see the quite evident thing that for later born girls are more disadvantaged than boys. But this pattern is not really visible for 2016. But in the regression analysis, we'll see that once I control for the other variables, the pattern is more or less the same. So looking at the results section, you can see that female dummy is positive and consistently positive throughout the all panels, and the panels are differentiated depending on the fixed effects and depending on the control variables that are included. And you can see that female variable is positive throughout the panels, which means that there is no evident discrimination against girls, or there is no clear son preference. But the situation changed as long as you look at the interaction term between girl and birth order, and you can see that this girl penalty is actually emerging with the second born girls, or especially pronounced for the later born girls. Although not all the time statistically significant, the pattern is clearly negative, which means that later born girls are more disadvantaged compared to their eldest sisters. The situation is quite the opposite for boys, because third or later born boys within the household are the most advantaged compared to their eldest brothers. And here the height advantage is again consistently positive. The indigeneity problem in this estimation strategy is coming from the fertility decisions, because other variables such as gender and birth order are exogenous, but fertility decision of parents can be endogenous, because depending on the gender composition of previous children, parents can increase their desired fertility. In order to account for that, I'm running robustness check using the panel structure of the data, and I restrict the sample for mothers who didn't have children between 2011 and 2016. By doing so, I am imposing a very strict assumption that if mother didn't have children within this period, I'm assuming that they have already finished their fertility. And here you can see a clear pattern of later born boys being advantaged compared to the eldest son. And again, later born girls disadvantaged compared to the eldest daughters. And the height advantage for the youngest son is around 0.5 height for HZ scores. And for girls, it's roughly the opposite of negative 0.5 Z scores. So in order to check the robustness of those results, I'm running another estimation using a different dependent variable on breastfeeding duration to see if there is a clear son preference pattern. So here, the breastfeeding duration was only available for 2016 wave. That's why I run the estimation only for 2016. And the results again indicate a very strong later born son preference. And for girls, it's quite the opposite. And you can see that boys, the latest born, third or later born boys within the household are breastfed for around 1.5 months more than eldest son. But the situation is quite opposite for girls, even though the quantity quality trade-off of later born children should be disadvantaged. It's not the case for boys. So there are a number of strengths of this study. The first one is that, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first evidence generated for Kyrgyzstan using microdata on the impact of son preference on child physical development. And the next one is about the methodology, because the data set allowed me to control for a wide range of variables. And since the data was collected at the community level, I also clustered the standard errors at that level. And I included district fixed effects in order to account for the immediate variable bias that is coming from shared facilities in the community or unobserved heterogeneity that is specific for districts. And the last is that I'm using the panel structure of the data in order to partially address the indigeneity. And I still believe that it is quite a strict assumption to say that if a mother didn't give birth within 5 years, it's a completed fertility. However, there are a number of limitations to this study. The first of my data quality shown in the main results, income coefficient was inconsistent throughout the waves and panels, which I believe is the problem of the data because of the income reporting bias, and also in developing countries, it's a matter of informal sector, which is quite large. And I believe that it played quite a substantial role in the precision of the data. The next one is missing values for bride kidnapping. Since I restricted the data for children under the age of 5, I already had a small, quite a small sample compared to the original sample of the data set. And bride kidnapping values were missing in many of the cases, but I was planning to use it as a part of Mother Empowerment Index, since I believe that it's quite a strong indicator of empowerment. The next one is missing interview dates for 2011 and for 2012. And this is very important in my case because I'm using height for HZ scores. And according to WHO standards of growth for children under 5, this has to be calculated using age in month. And since the interview dates were missing, the best option that I had was to multiply the age of a child by 12, which gives me less variation in the age of a child. But in a perfect case scenario, I would have subtracted interview dates from the birth date of a child and get a precise month age of a child in month. Other concern is omitted variable bias, as first of all, I didn't have any preconditions on maternal health in the data set, so I couldn't control for that, which can be a very strong indicator of child health. At the same time, I didn't have any existing child diseases or the disease history for a child, which I again failed to control for. Next one was parental anthropometric measures, is that child weight and height is only calculated for children under 17, but I didn't have these indicators for parents, which is again a strong indicator of children's height. And the last one is the desired fertility, which is not asked in the questionnaire. So to conclude, in general, I didn't find strong evidence on discrimination against girls in general, but birth order and the gender interaction plays quite a crucial role because girl penalty emerged for later born girls only. However, the situation is quite favorable for boys if they're later born sons and they have a height advantage and breastfed for around 1.5 months more compared to their eldest brothers, despite the quantity-quality trade-off of children. And this result is quite compelling because recent evidence by Jayachandran and Kuzumenko on son preference indicates an eldest son preference in the context of India. And the only difference between India and Kyrgyzstan, which can explain these differences in the outcomes, is the traditional difference of who stays with parents. Because in India, it is the eldest son who stays with parents and takes care at their old age, while in Kyrgyzstan, traditionally these are the youngest sons. And this traditional difference seems to define the importance of a child in the household and also define the subsequent allocation of resources for children. Given the positive correlation between height for age and also standards of living of children later in life, I believe that this question is of an importance, and it is very important to achieve equity in health for all children, regardless of their gender and also birth order. That was it from my side. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you. Great, Manzura. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And please, questions from the audience. So we have a question from Zafar Kurbanov. And let me try to put, can we put him on Zafar on a panel?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Manzura. Yes, glad to hear you. And it was nice, interesting presentation.
Thank you very much, Zafar.
You're welcome. I texted here my question, but I can verbally tell this as well.
Yes.
So as a father of 2 children, I have a comment and maybe question.
Yes.
Usually from my experience and from other parents' experience, I think boys are more likely to get sick than girls. And as a result, they require more effort, caring by their parents, and plus more spending because they often get sick. So, so as a result, some studies can say that girls are discriminated against this. So does your study also consider this aspect that boys physically are different than girls, and that's why they get different attention, spending, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zafar, for your question and comment. Actually, I think it's more of intuitive answer, I would say, because digging into the literature, what I was seeing is that according to the quality-quantity trade-off, actually the later born children should be disadvantaged regardless of their gender. But if what you're saying is that boys are prone to get sick more often and so on, I believe then it has to be the opposite. So it had to be that they actually have lower height for age discourse because they get more sick, or I don't know, like they are breastfed. That's the thing, like for breastfeeding, the robustness check shows that it's actually they are breastfed for longer. And if it is only the matter that they just by nature get sick quite often, it should have been pronounced in the height for age discourse, because no matter how much you spend, it should have been at least insignificant. But since my results are getting significant only for boys here, I really believe that it is a matter of gender. And what was interesting is that it's only the matter for the girl penalty is only existing for later born girls, which means like for the first girl, like families are less conservative and they're okay with having a girl, to put it like in a very rude way. But as soon as this number exceeds their desired composition of boys and girls, they are more prone to neglect, I believe. But yes, it's a very interesting aspect, and I think I should consider it more.
Thank you. Thank you, Zafar and Manzura. Any other questions from the audience? I was just, Manzura, thank you. It was very, very interesting. And I think to me, it was something that we have in mind, but it was novel to do this study based on the data and analysis, right? I was wondering if there are specific, if the families have larger, more number of children, then that itself could also affect there are certain characteristics of the families that we don't control for, but that could also affect the characteristics of the second-born and third-born children in the family. So I was wondering if you're controlling for just the overall number of children in the family.
Yes, I control for the household size, which is basically controlling for the number of children, given that the adult composition is staying more or less constant. But also I understand that what you're saying. And for me, it was interesting to see that household size should be affecting negatively the child health, but it was kind of consistent with the theory for girls, which was negative, although not statistically significant, but this pattern was not holding for boys, which I believe is a sign of son preference, if not anything else. But I do agree that there are many, many variables that can affect child nutrition rates, and as I listed in the limitations, I didn't have chance to control for all of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is another from Elisa Mandieva. So I'm putting Elisa on.
Thank you, Mr. Ukueva. So hi, everyone. I had a question to Manzura in regard to first of all, thank you very much for very insightful, interesting research, and I think it's a unique research. If we think that's in Central Asia, so I do know several gender research, gender studies, but this is indeed very interesting, and you somehow reflected very much on the society's how you call it, it's kind of creations, you know, it's in Russian they say сначала ляльку, а потом сначала няньку, а потом ляльку, right? So suppose we need someone who take care of the child. That's actually girls. If they're born first, it's perfect, but later on they prefer the lalku, so the real baby. So yeah. Somehow reflects, your daughter somehow reflects the sayings in Kyrgyzstan, you know. It's very interesting. So another thing would be for me very interesting, you know, the difference between, you know, rural and urban society, if you have an opportunity to control for this, you know. And the second would be interesting to see how actually the working mother has an, you know, this variable has an effect on the preferences of girls or boys at the end of the, you know, later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your comment. For the first part about the rural and urban, I did check that difference. And if you remember in panel C, I also include district fixed effect. And in the life in Kyrgyzstan dataset, I had 2 cities, which are Bishkek and Osh. And I tried to eliminating or to differentiating between Bishkek and Osh and the rest of the country. I was getting the same results. That's why I didn't report it separately. And as for the next part, I think I didn't consider it. And thank you very much for this comment. I think it's an important aspect, and I will try to look at it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, we are almost out of time. And I want to thank all the presenters and participants for their questions, for very lively, interesting discussion. We've looked at tried to model the bride kidnapping behavior. We have looked at the importance of quantity-quality trade-off for Kyrgyzstan and didn't find the effect, the trade-off. We've looked at the role of son preferences and birth order for Kyrgyzstan with the last paper, and found interesting results that what matters is so the effect on boys and girls are different, and also depends on the order of birth, which is also very interesting and novel research has been done by our presenters, and I'm hoping that they get interesting comments and questions that they will incorporate in their research. So we are finalizing the panel. Thank you very much for participation, for discussions. And I'll hope to see you tomorrow for the conference.